Hello, everybody. It's the Alco Diesel guy, and probably pretty much all of you knew this was coming. After the overpriced train set that was the Bachmann Coastliner, I of course had to take, as I mentioned kind of in that video, I had to take a look at the Walthers competition for that, which is known as the Walthers Trainline Flyer Express. And just to keep the theme consistent, I'm going to be reviewing the CSX variation of that particular set. And here is a close-up of it. Well, anyway, without any further ado, let's get started. First off, we'll take a closer look at the box. And one thing I should mention before I go much further here, this is in fact an American company, whereas Bachmann is actually a Chinese company owned by Kadar. Walthers is still an American company, although this is manufactured in China. As you see on the side, they show us how easy it is to set up this set. And I must note also another nice little positive thing which I found out most recently. When I did my initial documentary on lifelike trains, I had initially thought they were still using Easy Track, but as it turns out, lifelike has since switched back to Power Lock, which in my opinion is noticeably superior to the inferior Bachmann Easy Track, which is hopelessly outdated. So as you can see there's pictures of that. On the back of the box, we see some scenery accessories and some switch accessories that are still available for Power Lock, apparently. I'm going to have to look into that, about building a basic layout, maybe even try to put one up this Christmas. Haven't done that in a couple of years. As you can see here, we get a box car, we get a gondola car, and we get a standard hopper car. And on the front, and again on the side, we are shown the loop of track we get. Again, please note, this is a loop of track, not a circle. And the track is also nickel silver, not steel alloy, like the infamous Easy Track that I received on the Coastliner set, or that set comes with. We also see that it has a power pack transformer set up a little bit, not quite as modern as Bachmann's, but not old-fashioned either, I would say. It is a pretty easy to work with system, but not quite as goof-proof as that one, perhaps, but nonetheless not extremely difficult. You still don't require a screwdriver to assemble the set, which is definitely a plus. Without further ado, let's get this box open and take a good look at all the contents and get everything out. I must also note, too, that this box is surprisingly compact for a train set. It is noticeably smaller and easier to handle than the Bachmann Coastliner set I reviewed earlier. And here again we see everything else. I should note the locomotive I didn't describe too much before, I'll go into it now, is a GP15 CSX locomotive instead of the 40 that we had with the Bachmann set. It is equipped with 2 flywheels, which I'll get into more detail later on. The caboose itself looks a little bit like the Bachmann stuff. In fact, this looks almost disturbingly like Bachmann, but I guarantee you it is Walthers Trainline, not Bachmann. Let's go ahead and get the tracks out. Again, this is a complete loop of track. All the turn sections are in the front here, where the power pack is. We see the power pack and transformer on the bottom. See, these tracks, again, are the power lock setup. Again, as I mentioned in the lifelike documentary film, another nice little touch on these tracks is they have this sort of textured side to it to sort of simulate the ballast differently. That is to say, they have different colors and a sort of rougher texture around the plastic to make it sort of simulate ballast more realistically. As we go deeper into the set, we see that there's some documentation in the lower box section. See right here. Something lifelike was always known for in the past, and this is something I failed to go into in my lifelike documentary, is that their sets always came with a comprehensive guide to making scenery and other such detailed parts for the set, or sort of modifying things to make them more detailed. They never actually showcased any of Lifelike's products. What we're seeing here, though, is a little bit of a combination of both a sort of promotional thing to show you how to do stuff like that to detail scenery, but there's also sort of a comprehensive mini guide to basic accessories they have available to create your own layout. Nice little touches there, etc. As you can see here, there's a comprehensive description on how to build the board or table set up for the layout on a 4x8 sheet of plywood and how to detail it. Nice little touches added to it. Needless to say, there's also some promotional material on what accessories are available. Not much in terms of that. It's more or less a guide to get you into model railroading in general. An interesting feature I have to point out here is the fact that there is a Bachmann train set placed very carefully behind the Walthers train set. I'm not sure if this is some kind of licensing agreement they had with Bachmann, but still it's kind of peculiar for a competitor to appear behind the main train set. One has to wonder almost if Bachmann was doing some of the manufacturing. But again, this is supposed to be by Trainline, and the track is completely different, so I'm not sure if that makes any sense. I just find this very peculiar. And again, we have a fully comprehensive instruction guide, which isn't too complicated itself. The tracks are a bit on the tricky side to join. I'll get into that later. The power pack's a bit on the old school side. Again, you don't need, much like the Bachmann system, you don't need screws, but the wires are instead spring clamps. I'll get into that later. We also have a brief sort of description on the locomotive and maintenance to the locomotive. As we can see on the lower right over there, it shows the dual flywheeled motor that this particular locomotive has, in sharp contrast to the Bachmann locomotive on the Coastliner set that just had while it had a dual point motor and all-wheel drive, it didn't have flywheels. In fact, it didn't even have worm gear covers. So this is a noticeable upgrade right then and there. It's still not the most expensive engine around, but still a lot better, and it still utilizes wheel wipers. I'll get into more detail on that locomotive later on. Let's take a good look at the track now. As I mentioned, this is again power lock, not easy track. The main feature is it doesn't use this traditional type fish plates or rail joiners. Instead, it uses these spring-loaded pieces of metal on either end, and it locks in diagonally, which gives a much stronger connection. Unlike easy track, the track is unable to flex or pivot in any way, and again, the spring-loaded metal connectors really do a great job of avoiding getting warped, as the tension is always on them, and therefore they simply don't have any room to move to actually warp. Now let's go deeper into the set box itself. As you can see, there's another piece of styrofoam, similar box style to what Bachmann did, only on a much smaller scale with two different sections. This particular section contains the freight cars as we saw before, as well as the terminal rerailer, as well as two more sets of actual curved track. Again, this is a full loop, not a circle, but you need that many turns to make a track loop. And once again, to point out, this track, in addition to being power lock, is nickel silver, not steel alloy. And so without further ado, let's go ahead and get the tracks set up. Again, setting these tracks up is a bit on the tricky side. They require a little force to get put into position. Again, to get this track joined, we line up both sides carefully, apply a little pressure on both ends of the track, and snap it into position. It's very critical to make sure that the track joins straight across. Again, this track, because it lines in horizontally, doesn't necessarily line up perfectly on the first attempt. If you don't have the track perfectly joined straight across, which is this track's Achilles heel, it will not join correctly, and you'll have an actual deflection in the track. If this occurs and the train hits this, it will go sailing off onto your carpet, or we're still onto your concrete floor. So it's very critical that you make sure the track is properly aligned, meaning that both sections meet straight across each other and are not slightly shifted in one direction or the other. Much like the real railroads, this can lead to a major derailment, which is not fun, especially if you're setting this on a table above a concrete floor. And yes, I'm speaking from experience. With our rudimentary layouts now set up, it's time to go ahead and pull the rest of the accessories out of the box. We'll start off with the transformer / controller. I'm still old school, so I call them transformers. And you can see here it's definitely a modern upgrade from the classic lifelike blue transformers they used to include. The accessory terminals and track terminals are all spring-loaded clamps. A bit on the old school side, but not the hardest thing in the world to work with. The power brick is right there, standard off-the-shelf power brick, plugs right into the unit itself. And then we have the terminal wires, as they're called. There are two ends of these that go in, obviously, on the tracks. They're almost old-school rail joiner like. And as we can see what I was talking about here, they do pretty much literally look like rail joiners, the old school rail joiners from classic Code 100 sort of HO scale train sets that you would get back in the day. There are two little sort of hook-like slides, I guess you could call them, metal pieces protruding out of the terminal connections on the terminal track itself. These two simply slide onto them, much like rail joiners would slide onto tracks. They're a little bit tricky to get in there, not quite as easy, I must say, as the Bachmann plug. But to be fair to Lifelike, they had to design their own system. There's no way they could have gotten away with copying Bachmann's. So anyway, you slide them in place as I'm showing you right here. And while they're a bit awkward to get in place, you could hardly compare them to the annoying spring-loaded clamp wire terminal clamps that the old-school rerailers that Lifelike used to make, as well as Tyco and most of the rest of the companies did back in the day, that were prone to crossing wires and slipping out. Anyway, in terms of connecting the wires up to the power pack, this is sort of old-school yet new-school. We see here there are two different terminals set up, again, two wires each, one to track and one to accessories. We connect the two wires to the two track section, as obviously making perfect sense there. Again, spring-loaded terminals, so make sure to push the clamps back and then slide the wire right in. Once the wire is in place, simply let go of the clamp and it should hold in place perfectly. Also note, it doesn't really matter which wire goes into which terminal, as long as you don't cross them. and as long as you ensure that both track wires are going to the actual track terminal connections on the back of the transformer itself. If your locomotive does start to run backwards when it should go forward, simply reverse the wires to get the proper result. Next, we'll move on to connecting the actual power pack up to the controller or transformer. Pretty simple. Go to the, again, two-wall connection and plug it right in. And next, we'll move on to actually getting the train onto the track. Again, we have a terminal derailleur, so we're going to utilize that. We place the locomotive roughly on the tracks and gently run it back and forth until the wheels drop into position and we stop hearing the annoying clicking noise from the ties. It also helps to know at this point which direction you want the train to run in, as you're committed to whatever direction the locomotive is facing. With the locomotive onto the track, we'll move on to derailing the freight cars themselves. Again, same procedure. Place them roughly on the track above the derailleur, run them back and forth until they stop clicking. Another detail I should point out on all these cars is they actually have metal wheels, unlike the Bachmann cars, and they also have, if we look here, spring-loaded knuckle couplers. Two things the Bachmann cars did not have on the coastliners that I reviewed earlier. I consider the detailing of these freight cars to be on par with the Bachmann coastliner set. One mark I must definitely put against these cars is they are extremely light. There is literally no weight to them whatsoever. And last but certainly not least is the caboose, which I must say is very nicely painted for an entry-level model here. Again, metal wheels, and again the sprung knuckle couplers, nice touch. The standard Bachmann coastliner, again, which I have since upgraded some of those cars to them as I'm running them currently, had to make do with plastic wheels and the annoying plastic sprung couplers, which in my opinion really took the set down a couple notches on quality. I must also note this little part, which I would later find out was actually part of one of the pilots, something I'll get into more detail on when I take a closer look at the locomotive. It was actually missing from the back. I'll show that to you later on. And without further ado, let's give this thing a run. The transformer's already been plugged in, so I'm just going to turn it on. Gives a nice reassuring click. What's going on here? Why isn't she moving? As it turns out, the set of terminal wires I received were damaged, whether in shipping or in manufacturing, I don't know. Whatever the case, to get this set to run, I had to hold the wires in a very awkward position. Operation was pretty smooth once I figured out this issue, although I did expose another weird quirk. The power terminal track only has one connection on it, as you can see, and that's toward the inside in this case, so if I was smart, which I was not, I would have reversed its direction to make it easier to connect. The locomotive made an audible whine to it, but nowhere near as terrible or horrendous as the Bachmann set did. The track performed flawlessly, giving great conductivity with its nickel-silver coating between the wheels of the locomotive and the actual rails itself, transferring power smoothly, no hesitation at any point on the tracks. The headline of the locomotive was also much brighter, I noticed, as the LED on it. Really nice quality product for the price. It's still an economy model, but considering this locomotive's immediate and sort of spiritual predecessor used a ring motor and was known for hesitating and stalling all over the place, this is a huge leap forward, not to mention the fact that that locomotive didn't even have all-wheel drive, let alone flywheels. At higher speed, there is some more noise from the locomotive, but still not too bad, easily livable and well within specifications, not annoying. Just let you know it's running. And again, we're talking about an economy locomotive here, not a hardcore model like an Atlas Master Series, etc. And now for the all-important reversing test. We simply slide the switch on the top there backward and turn the throttle back on, and the train will now run backwards. And as we can see, this set did a very good job going backwards, no derailments, stayed on the tracks beautifully despite the extremely sort of lacking of weight on the cars. But again, to keep the price down to something resembling affordable, there are some sacrifices that must be made, and so I guess this is acceptable in the case of this particular set. Next, let's take a good look at the Locomotive, which is a GP15. This is not a new model, incidentally. When GM introduced it, they essentially rebuilt these out of old GP9s and 7s. They have a distinctive spotting feature in the form of this hump on the back, which is a special air filter housing for the 645 prime mover that replaced the old 567s these units would have had before they were rebuilt. This project was initiated by EMD as it found it was losing a lot of money to railroad companies that were rebuilding their locomotives out of existing parts they had or acquired themselves. This gave EMD a way into this particular market, which was a lower end market than any of its new locomotives could match in terms of their price. On the back, we now see the actual missing pilot I showed before. To get into this locomotive, like many others, we need to remove the couplers, although an easier way of getting in would be to remove the pilot, although I found them very tricky to get out. The one on the rear happened to be off, so this wasn't necessary as it turned out, but I went ahead and removed it anyway. The next step is to remove the two screws adjacent to the couplers themselves. These actually secure the shell down onto the chassis itself. And once these screws are off, the chassis can be separated from the shell by gently pulling it up. Be careful, as the top headlight is in fact secured directly to the shell itself and is connected with a wire. Pulling too hard will rip this out, and you'll need to resolder it if you do. So again, be careful how far you lift the shell off. As we can see again, the motor does in fact have two flywheels. It appears to be a higher quality motor with 5 poles in it. Still has a bit of a whine to it, as I showed before, but not too bad. Again, there is a gearbox on top of each truck with a worm gear cover holding everything in place. The worm gear again transferring the power to the trucks. There's also this annoying little speaker box on the back here, which is an interesting feature, but annoying because you can't actually find a sound kit off the shelf for this, or even a DCC install kit for it. Let's get the shell back on so we can take a look at the trucks themselves. And here there isn't anything too shocking. As it turns out, this locomotive is still using the same technology that Bachmann uses, wheel wipers on all the wheels, although it is equipped with all-wheel pickup. The wheel wipers themselves require separate maintenance. It also lacks bearings. Again, this means that more maintenance is required on the trucks to keep them in good shape, as again, the plastic will tend to wear down when, if not properly lubricated. We also note the logo on the bottom of the locomotive that says Walthers, made in China. Again, this is an American company, so if you want to be patriotic about your train purchases, this is one way of doing it. Anyway, let's get the couplers back on. And now, of course, we've come to the point in this review where I have to give my final verdict on the set and whether I think it's worthwhile. Well, when you consider the Bachmann Coastliner set with its single ring of steel track was $240, this particular set's price of $229.98 seems much more reasonable, especially considering you're getting more, including power lock track that is nickel silver and a much longer loop of it, unlike the Bachmann Coastliner, which just gave you a simple circle of steel alloy track, metal wheels and metal sprung couplers on the cars, unlike the Bachmann Coastliner, which again had plastic wheels and plastic sprung couplers on its freight cars. Even if they were a bit on the light side, you could easily rectify this by installing some stick-on weights that are available. You also get a somewhat nicer detailed locomotive with a better motor in it. In short, if you're looking for a good train set to get started in the hobby or to get someone else started in the hobby, etc., this is a great place to start. It's way worth the money charged, especially considering what it comes with. So I would definitely recommend this set for someone getting into the hobby. And that'll about do it for this review. If you liked my review, please feel free to thumbs up and like it and subscribe. If you didn't, thumbs down and dislike it. Thank you very much for watching, and as always, keep the metal side down.